about to make into, I think, an important moment. That we should be discussing the quality of our policing and the accountability of the policing at a time like this is critical. As those officers go to Haiti, the international world, the international attention will be on Kenyan police officers. We also, as Amnesty, would caution that they are going into a very volatile situation, and that as much as we are concerned about the quality of policing at this point, it is also important that we note that they need to be kept safe. So it is in that context that we will make the following points and recommendations. It is sad in some ways that the contingent of police were not being deployed in 2022, because in that year we saw what was probably the best example of what it is like to have a police service that can maintain law and order during elections. With a number of human rights organizations, tens of dialogues and workshops were developed between community leaders, human rights defenders, and police officers, including commanding officers, throughout the country to ensure that there would be dialogue and that there would be community policing approach to the electoral process. And as we all know, it was probably one of the most peaceful of the elections. The question we have to ask ourselves is why 1 year later have we seen such violence, such brutality, and such a level of denialism on the part of the security services and, to some extent, Harambee House. We, as Amnesty International, with several agencies, including Human Rights Watch, the Kenya Medical Association, the Law Society of Kenya, conducted 3 empirical missions to investigate the quality of policing during the phase that we now call Mandamano. And I would like to just give you a couple of the findings from those 2 reports. The first report was released on May the 31st and essentially was a statement following interviews with about 115 witnesses and victims in that period, March to April. The second second report was done and released to the country on August the 4th, and this was a more in-depth study that essentially looked at what had happened in Kisumu and Migori primarily, but also in some of the other areas. These 2 reports are before you as the committee, and what we found in the 2 reports was that 5 fundamental constitutional freedoms were violated over the last 6 months. The first is the right to life, Article 26 of the Constitution, Article 37 of the Constitution, the right to peaceful assembly, Article 36 of the Constitution, the right to association, and Article 33 of the Constitution, the freedom of expression, and lastly, the right to a fair trial. 60 days after the first round of protests, that was in March, based on our interviews with 115 witnesses, we found that there had been excessive and unnecessary use of force, particularly lethal force, leading to the deaths of over 12 verified individuals. Most of the people who were killed were bystanders. They claimed not to be part of the demonstrations, and they were unarmed. Most of them were young, between the ages of 20 and 30, and most of them, at least half of them, had died as a result of gunshot wounds. We listened to the testimony of the mother of Precious Kimunto, a 4-month-old Kibera infant who was tear-gassed in her home and suffocated to death on March the 30th. Many of us watched in horror as tear gas was thrown into schools, leading to an entire school being evacuated, an entire class being evacuated and taken to hospital because they had inhaled tear gas of substances that we, as far as we know, we do not have a sense of how safe they were to use on minors. Towards the end of July, we traveled to Migori and to Kisumu. We spoke to county government officials. We spoke to police officers, prosecutors, We spoke also to medical doctors, journalists, survivors, and families of victims. And we heard that there had been 107 cases of assault. Many of those cases, again, 47 of them, were cases that had seen gunshot wounds, and in many cases, these gunshot wounds had left people either very seriously injured or dead. We, with our own eyes, verified the deaths of 11 individuals at the referral hospital. Most of them were male, and most of them were between the ages of 17 and 38. We listened to medical practitioners, doctors, who said that police officers chased protesters and bystanders into the referral hospital and threw tear gas into the hospital, leading to tear gas going into the hospital wards. We had journalists who were unable to cover the stories because they were being attacked either by police officers or by protesters. We had medical doctors and medical health practitioners who could not reach places of medical facilities because they could not access and get through the violence that took place. In many ways, the experience we have had over the last 6 months are probably the worst violence we have seen for several years, possibly since 2017. Therefore, we have a number of recommendations, 5 to be specific. The first is that in the spirit of the bipartisan committee that has been set up, to lay rest the denialism that we have seen, most sensationally by the Inspector General, that bodies had been imported into the referral hospital, into the mortuary, for the purposes of the media. We would require you, humbly ask you to essentially do joint fact-finding missions to places like Nyanza, places like Nairobi and Mombasa. And we as Amnesty, with the Missing Voices Alliance and other organizations, would be very happy to facilitate, to organize those trips so that you are able to very quickly determine independently what actually happened over this period. The second recommendation is that you require the Inspector General of the National Police Service, as the lead commander of our 100,000 officers and the lead commander of the troops that will go to Haiti and will be covered on national and international television. I think we have to brace ourselves for seeing Kenyan police officers on CNN, on Voice of America, and various other international media to come before the committee. And we would request the following line of inquiry. The first is that the IG commits to not shield his officers from legal processes that would have the officers responsible for the violence that we saw over the last 6 months be brought before a court of law. Secondly, that there be a commitment to desist from the use of non-uniformed officers. And in fact, as Amnesty, we have tried to get, a response from the police service on what is the policy with regards to informers and undercover police officers in times of protest and in moments when Kenyans are lawfully seeking to protest and to assemble. One of the things we were told by several journalists and medical officers was that the use of non-uniformed police officers and the embedding of police officers among journalists, among protesters, and even among medical practitioners, if you remember the viral clip of police officers climbing out of an ambulance, is that it put our doctors, our nurses, and our journalists in harm's way. The third line of inquiry is essentially that schools, places of learning, medical centers have to be off limits to police officers. I'm sure there will be agreement from the Kenya Medical Association, from the Kenya National Union of Teachers, from the head teachers associations, that in a time when there is tension and there is violence, police officers should not be entering our schools and our medical centers with live ammunition and batons and tear gas. And the last one, essentially, is that we must have safe passage for emergency health workers and journalists at times when there is turmoil. The third recommendation relates to the two principal actors that are responsible for investigations and prosecutions. We would ask the committee to request of the Independent Policing Oversight Authority to clarify how many of the 107 cases that were documented in July have actually moved to prosecution. How many of the cases that involve the lethal use of force and the death of both civilians and police officers, how many of those cases have been taken to a court of law? And I think on the second part, obviously the preserve of the prosecution arm of our government is the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Fourthly, and I'm coming to the last recommendation, that the Ministry of Interior be requested to explain why do we still have a delay of 5 years since the National Assembly passed the Prevention of Torture Act and the National Coroner Service Act, and why aren't those two laws being implemented with the alacrity that is required in order to keep Kenyans safe. It may be opportune at this point, particularly in terms of the last 6 months, and in terms of our officers going abroad to protect Haitians, for a national police conference to be organized. There have been several of these in the past. Under the previous administration, one of the important open door policies that they had was essentially accessibility. And I can speak with confidence and experience that I was able to get through to the Cabinet Secretary, to the Principal Secretary, to various arms of the Interior Ministry with the capacity that we would be listened to, and not always did they act on our recommendations or our advice, but at least we had access. We were also able to make memoranda to the policing conference, and some of the reforms that have come with regards to the condition of police officers has really come as a result of the interventions of Amnesty and several other organizations like IMBLU, like Haki Africa and others. So it is a time like this that we need policy dialogue on this issue. Let me turn to the last issue, which is somewhat out of the realm of the policing environment that we have had up to now, but is extremely important. The incidences of enforced disappearances are returning. The use of special squads are beginning to lead us to concern that we are going to start seeing more people disappearing under this administration. His Excellency the President gave a public assurance to this nation that his government would not be a government of the shadows. It would not be a government that would not remain within the rule of law. And I think one of the concerns that we have is that we are starting to see a return to the kind of situation we saw in Yala. Allow me to bring up one incident just to illustrate how dangerous this is. 3 months before the elections, 2 Indian contractors disappeared with a Kenyan driver. They were members of the campaign team for the Kenya Kwanza campaign, and those 2 contractors disappeared into the thick of the night. They were captured on CCTV camera, we know this. Police officers have been able to track down the actual police officers that stopped their vehicle, and up to now, that case has not progressed. Why? Because we have a lacuna in our law, which says that if you cannot find the bodies of people who have disappeared, then that legal process is almost in jeopardy from the onset. I think the Kenya Kwanza national government requires itself to find a way, not just in the memory of those 2 Indian contractors, but in the spirit and in the protection of all people who have disappeared, all the families of the people who have disappeared, to find a legal framework that ensures that enforced disappearances are not a part of our national culture. I would like to stop there, knowing that the committee may have questions or comments, and as always, as Amnesty, we come in good faith, based on evidence and with a hope to find a bridge between what offends our Constitution and the way forward. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies.
Well, we thank you.